Rocking and rolling? We are rocking and rolling. What's up, guys? I'm Nick, and this is Build Dad Build. Just the tip. And today we're talking about epoxy. But first, what do you think about this mug? If you dig that mug or you want to check out their selection, I'll leave a link down below. And if you use promo code BUILD15, you get 15% off your order plus free shipping. Dun, dun, dun. Now let's go to the garage. Okay, first, let me preface this by saying I am not an expert. Hold on one second. Dude. I am not an expert by any means when it comes to epoxy. I mean, really, I'm pretty much a professional idiot. So these tips are definitely gonna be for beginners. These are just some things that I've learned along the way or some mistakes that I've made that hopefully if I tell you about them, you won't make. That being said, let's get on to tip number 1 of
Just the Tip.
Here we have a sign that we are going to fill with epoxy. We're gonna fill everything that I routed out with epoxy. Epoxy is expensive, and therefore I don't wanna mix up any more epoxy than I absolutely have to, right? And normally if you're gonna pour epoxy, you can use an Epoxy Calculator, like the one on Total Boat's site. I'll link it down below, but you give it a height times width times depth situation and it'll tell you how much to pour out. However, I would have to go in and figure out the dimensions of each one of these letters to do that. So the first tip is we're gonna fill this whole thing with sand. Just regular old playground sand. I just went and picked this up. I thought I had some, but I didn't. So I had to go to the hardware store and pick some up.
You're welcome.
We go stabby stab with the pointy point. Grab yourself a cup from the good old days.
Oh, I used to drink beer out of you.
And we go scoopy scoop in the sandy sand. Okay, and you can go as accurate as you want with that. I know that I'm not gonna pour this up to the edge of the carve because if I do that, since it's burned, it might run out into some of the texture. So I'm gonna leave it a little bit like this, but you can come in and you get the drift. You can sweep it up until it's perfect. And then we grab this bad boy, just an empty bin. This might be a horrible idea, now that I think about it. Worked better than I thought. And I know that I need about 40 ounces. We'll probably round it up. Probably do like 48 just to have a little bit extra. But I know I need about 48 ounces of epoxy. But Nick, you ask, how do you get rid of the rest of the sand? Send it. Okay, now we are in BDB Central. This is where the magic happens, kids. This is where all the video editing and whatnot goes on. And I'm in here because I'm fortunate enough to be able to control the temperature of this room separate from the rest of the house. So that's a tip coming up. But I'm sitting up here with the sign and we are not gonna mix up our 48 ounces of epoxy yet because
Tip number 2.
first, we need to seal this piece, and the way I'm gonna do that is I'm gonna use penetrating epoxy, okay? Everything that I use in this video is gonna be by Total Boat. I'm gonna use 3 different products. I'm gonna use penetrating epoxy, I'm gonna use deep pour epoxy, and then I'm gonna use tabletop epoxy. That can get expensive. You could probably pull this off with just tabletop epoxy. If you didn't carve this deep, tabletop you could only pour up to 1/4 inch deep. So you could probably get away with just using that and using the tabletop, mixing up a little tiny amount of this tabletop to seal everything. But I have penetrating epoxy, so I'm gonna use penetrating epoxy. By the way, kids, epoxy is expensive. So I'm gonna leave a code down below for Total Boat. It'll get you 15% off your first order if you wanna get into something like this, because it's not a cheap hobby. Okay, so a couple more tips before we get started. One,
read your labels.
so many people ask in epoxy groups like what temperature that they need to be at and things like that. The answer is almost always it depends on the product. So once you pick something up, check the optimum temperature for that product. It should say it on the label. It should give you a range of like 10 to 15 degrees or something, you know, somewhere around there.
2,
Make sure you prep everything ahead of time. because the last thing you want to do is when working with this to like have to go run and get something while you're and cut into your working time. I'm just going to start with penetrating epoxy. I've already touched on it once, but I just need to reiterate. You want to seal whatever you're going to put epoxy in if it's made out of wood, because if not, you're going to get air bubbles and possibly leaks. I've seen people seal with like lacquer and stuff like that. That kind of makes me nervous. And penetrating epoxy behaves a little different. It's a lot thinner. You want to mix up a very small amount. If you mix up too much, which I've done, it will get so hot that it'll melt through the container. I still do not have a good way to calculate how much penetrating epoxy I need, so I usually mix just like an ounce or two. I'll probably mix a little bit more because the sign's so big, and just go.
Many tic-tacs later.
Okay, we're back. It's been a couple of days, kind of jacked up my back, so I took it easy this weekend. So the penetrating epoxy has had at least 48 hours to cure. We should be totally good there.
Now, my next tip is...
I'll read your labels again. Okay, so we're gonna be using Total Boat Thick Set. It says right here, for epoxy to cure fully, the ambient temperature must be between 65 and 80 degrees. So I have the AC cooling down to 70 right now. I found the lower end of that to give you a little bit longer working time. Remember, we already figured out we're gonna do 48 ounces. I'm going to measure that on a scale. I found it measuring on the scale as opposed to using the increments on these containers. The scale's more accurate, but read your labels. And the reason I say that is I've been told by other people that work with epoxy that different epoxies, some of them just go strictly by fluid ounces, or it has to be measured like in a container. I don't quite understand that, but I don't math very well. Another tip along the lines of mixing epoxy is make sure you know your ratios. So this is a 3-to-1 mixing ratio. I know I need 48 ounces, so here's a trick I use. I'm gonna take 48, I'm gonna divide it by 4, right? Which is what, 12? And then I'm gonna take that number and times it by 3, 36. So I know that I need 36 ounces of part A because this is the 3, and I need 12 ounces of part B. Okay, so this is kind of a do-it-your-own risk. You could mix the epoxies up separate for the black and the red. I am going to just pour off about 8 ounces of the red and pour it where it needs to go, and hopefully that's gonna be enough. If not, I will add a little bit to it. And then pour the rest black. When you're mixing epoxy, make sure that you get it all off the bottom, off the sides. Read your labels, it'll tell you how long to mix it. I think this is 3 to 5 minutes. Don't skimp on your mixing, because if you don't get it fully mixed, parts of it won't cure and you're gonna be a very unhappy camper. Now, let's glove up.
And get to work. Beaches.
Be so much better if this is gonna be like a beach themed thing. Anyway. Okay, I'm not liking the way that red looks. We're gonna let it sit for a second and see what happens. So I'm gonna mix it to black. Okay, I didn't like the way that red was looking because it wasn't red, it was hot pink. So I ran to the local like hobby store and picked up, I don't know where I put it now. I picked up some liquid pigment concentrate. I don't have a lot of experience with this, but the only red mica powder they had there was magenta, which is still pink. Much better. All right, guys, that feels like enough tips for this video. I did kind of get burned there with that color. I ordered this. This is Eye Candy Baku Red. It looked super red, and actually still the powder even looks really red, but when I mixed it up, it was really pink looking. It actually cured a little bit more red, but it still wasn't the red I wanted. So I'm happy that I went out and picked up the liquid pigment. I think that looks much better. I think that red is much truer to the company's colors. So let me know if you learned something in the comments down below. Or if you have any questions, leave those in the comments down below too. Maybe we'll do a part 2 of epoxy.
Just a tip.
And as always, none of this would be possible without my patrons. Thank you guys. I'll line them up right down here. I want to give a single shout out to Jim Carter, who just joined. Actually joined a couple weeks ago, and I keep forgetting to shout him out. Sorry about that, Jim, but Clinkies, my man. Appreciate it. And as always, there are my Boilermakers, my top tier patrons. Nick the Greek, Stephen Mann, Eric Weiss, Derek Coates, Caveman Ross, Chuck Faulkner, Puppy Muffins, and Mike Penrod. The highest of Clinkies to you folks. And until next time, thanks for playing. And now I gotta get to work.